You're watching a More Beautiful World podcast with Susan Renee, a channel for those of you with open minds and courageous hearts who are looking for guidance on your trauma healing and personal transformation journeys. Here, I share with you the powers of intentional plant medicine use, along with other holistic therapies and spiritual guidance to guide you on your path forward. I'm so eager to share with you what I've learned in working with these sacred plant medicines on my own journey, including the knowing that what we do to heal ourselves, we do to heal the whole collective. Join me as I share my experiences, knowledge, and wisdom to guide your trauma healing so you can transform your life, and so that together we can create the more beautiful world we all know is possible. Well, hello and welcome to another episode of A More Beautiful World. And in this episode, I'm going to guide you through an exploration of the emotion of shame, which really is one of the lowest vibrational emotions we can experience. As I've had a lot of time for introspection in my own self-development work lately, I've become aware of some deep-seated shame that is ready for clearing. And what I'm noticing in myself and what I've noticed in my clients over time is that wherever there is a need for trauma and addiction healing, and where there is a need for recovery and transformation, there seems to be an underlying emotion of shame that needs to be dealt with. Which is why we'll be exploring in this episode what shame is, where it comes from, what perpetuates shame cycles, and of course, how to stop the shame cycle, recover, and transform from shame. So if you are eager to learn how to get out of the cycles of shame and how to step more deeply into your own recovery and transformation process, then this episode is for you. A quick ask, as always, before we dive into this episode, if you are listening on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or any other of the audio platforms, please make sure you drop me in a rating and a review. I would love to know what you think about the podcast, and your support in rating me does help me get these messages out into the world. And make sure you follow the pod while you're there too. And of course, if you are watching me on YouTube, remember to like this video, subscribe for more, and drop a comment on what you think. So as we go through here today, I am going to start with sharing why I'm delivering this topic to you and how this need to recover from shame really came into my awareness and being. From there, I'm going to go through and talk about and share what shame is, where it comes from, what sets it apart from guilt. And we'll explore how shame almost always, at least as I have experienced it, is at the root of addiction and trauma healing. And of course, from there, once we have more clarity around what shame is, where it comes from, why it shows up, then we'll move into talking about ways that I've learned to work on healing those deep-seated shame wounds. So let me start off a little bit today with a story of how this episode came into being and how the concept of really needing to heal shame came into my awareness. So I am coming off recently, I'm about a week off of having COVID for 12 days. And let me tell you, I had a lot of downtime. And in that downtime, I became very introspective and was really feeling into my own self-development process and my own self-development and transformational journey. And with all of that time in self-reflection and introspection, as I was moving through the healing process of COVID, there was something that just kept bubbling up. I started to notice this theme, and there felt like it was like something really deep, and there was this deep-seated issue that needed to be dealt with. I was finding as I was down with COVID, a lot of negative self-talk coming in around not being productive enough, not showing up for my business enough, And I was really upset with myself one day around this because even though I had a fever, my fever was like 101. I could barely think. I had a splitting headache. On this day, when I felt so awful, I caught myself talking negatively to myself for not doing enough work. And as I caught myself in this negative internal dialogue and this deep, really painful self criticism, I thought to myself, where in the heck is this coming from? Why am I speaking to myself this way? What is this? I certainly wouldn't be talking to my nephew this way. I wouldn't be talking to my partner this way or to my mom this way or anyone for that matter. Anyone who's got a fever and body aches and, chills and is just sick, right? I'm not going to yell at them to do more work. I'm just not. So why then was I talking to myself this way? And it got me to start becoming curious about where was this coming from? So I was sitting with that. And I ended up watching a spiritual service online that weekend from Unity of Phoenix, the spiritual center I used to go to down there. And their spiritual service was titled "Create Your Own Kingdom or Queendom." And in short, in that spiritual service, the Reverend was talking about how we create our own kingdom and queendom, and that we get to rule it all. We are the captains of our own destiny. And then the Reverend asked, where, as you survey your kingdom or queendom, where does it need work? Where are the areas you are not satisfied with the way it looks? And when I surveyed my own personal queendom, I realized a main piece of it that I didn't like. And I asked myself, why is this? Why do I have so much negative thought processes and so much criticism in this area? And why is this area still in need of so much work, right? Why am I not feeling joy here like I want to be? And so as I do on my spiritual Sundays, I felt into that and got curious about those questions and began a meditation process. And I really noticed again this deep-seated feeling like I wasn't enough, I wasn't good enough, I wasn't valuable enough, I wasn't talented enough, I wasn't deserving enough. And it all came down to recognizing that those feelings and what that is, I was experiencing shame. And I was feeling shame that was deep inside of me. And this illumination and expanded self awareness became a glaring theme of work I still needed to tackle, and during my time with COVID, again, I'm so grateful to have this illumination and this expanded awareness because things come up when they need healing. And this healing need became very present with me during my time recovering from COVID, which again is why I am sharing it with you all here today. So let's start with talking about what shame is, and let's get clarity around that emotion. I'm sure most of us have heard in our lives, you should be ashamed of yourself. Or maybe you've actually said that to someone and you've said to someone, you should be ashamed of yourself. But what exactly does it mean to feel ashamed? And how can you tell if you are experiencing shame in your life? At a basic level, shame is an underlying and pervasive belief that one is somehow defective or unacceptable. Now, the precise way in which one feels unacceptable or defective can be quite unique. This can show up in someone thinking or believing that they are too much of something. Maybe they think they are too sensitive, or maybe they believe they are too shy or too unattractive or too emotional. Or on the contrary, it can be a thinking or feeling or belief that they are not enough in some way. Maybe they feel as if they are not smart enough. Maybe they think they're not funny enough. Maybe they believe they're not thin enough. They're not cool enough. They're not successful enough, not good enough. There can be multiple and varying expressions of these feelings. And ultimately, a person can believe that they are defective or unacceptable in many different ways. And this leaves a person, with this shame feeling, which really can be boiled down to feeling, again, unworthy, unlovable, bad in some way, feeling unacceptable. So a few other definitions of shame, just to give a little more color and context around it. Shame has also been labeled the uncomfortable sensation we feel in the pit of our stomach when it seems as if we have no safe haven from the judging gaze of others. It has also been described as a self-conscious emotion arising from the sense that something is fundamentally wrong about oneself. Shame is also a deep, uncomfortable feeling of inadequacy and an unpleasant, self-conscious emotion often associated with negative self-evaluation, where one has motivation to quit and feelings of pain, exposure, distrust, powerlessness, and worthlessness. So maybe even in just hearing some of that, maybe you're noticing something stirring in you. Maybe you're noticing some of those expressions of shame resonating with you. And there are a lot of varying definitions, though ultimately I do want to make you aware that shame is one of the lowest vibrational emotions we can experience, which is why it can be so detrimental to our being, because it holds us back from being our truest selves, to really operating in the most authentic version with our highest expression. So let's explore a little bit more about that. Like, what does shame actually do? So when we have shame in us, when we are experiencing it, whether conscious or not, what does shame do? Well, shame will often lead a person to feeling a need to hide from others or keep the things that they are ashamed of a secret. So this comes into play a lot with addiction, comes into play a lot with trauma, where we might hide our traumas and are afraid to be seen as an addict, or we're afraid to have our traumas be known to others. And this hiding of the shame, the addiction, the trauma creates a lot of anxiety, because we have this fear of being found out. We have a fear of being exposed. We have a fear of being seen by others as not enough or too much, or whatever it is we are ashamed of. And this anxiety can certainly create all sorts of physical sensations and symptoms too. The shame can even lead us to believe that we have to be perfect. And it can lead to these really extreme perfectionistic personalities and tendencies. It can even lead us to withdraw from others, to become defensive and distant. And that leaves us feeling depressed. Someone with deep-seated shame or shame feelings, again, maybe they're aware or unaware of, it can lead someone to become overly responsible in the perfectionism, constantly seek approval from others in some ways. And it can also, show up again as addictions, infidelity, eating disorders, excessive dependency, or severe codependency in relationships, and so many other problematic behaviors. So I talked a little bit about what shame is and how it's showing up. So again, maybe you're starting to have some awareness as to how this might be playing into your life or is a part of your life. Maybe we're bringing it to your conscious mind. But I do want to make a quick note here on shame versus guilt, because the two are often associated with each other. And as we explore shame, I think it's important to separate them, because while they can feel similar There is one primary difference between guilt and shame, and that is this. Guilt is usually the sense that you have done something wrong, as in going against your moral code in some way and doing something that goes against your moral code. But shame is more of the sense that who you are is somehow wrong. Again, sometimes these emotions come in together and we may experience both shame and guilt. Though for the purpose of this podcast, I want to make sure we understand that fundamental difference, which again is guilt is usually the sense that you have done something wrong. And shame is more of the sense that who you are is somehow wrong. And I highlight that difference because we're talking about healing from the negative beliefs that shame carries, and that you are, or you believe you are, somehow wrong or defective. So I'm not talking in this podcast about guilt and necessarily about what you feel you have done wrong, right? This is really looking at that belief that we carry that we are somehow wrong or defective, that deep-seated shame. So before we get into how we stop the shame cycle, right? Let's explore a little bit about where shame comes from. And now that we know what shame is, I think it is easy for us to have the conversation around how do we identify where it has come from and where the roots of shame actually began. And let me tell you, especially as I, felt into this myself and did a lot of research in this space, the sources of shame can be many and they can be varied. Shame can be developed from having overly critical parents who told you in some way that you were not good enough. Even if you had very loving parents, if they maybe had high expectations of you, that could have left you as a child feeling like you couldn't measure up, that you weren't good enough. Or maybe you did not have so loving of parents and they were emotionally abusive or verbally abusive. That can create shame. And this is usually where I've seen ancestral trauma come in. Because if your parents experienced emotional abuse or verbal abuse, right, or any of these shaming tendencies or behaviors, if it happened to them, they are more likely to do it to you as their child. Shame can also, come from different partners, peers, siblings, relatives. It can come from schools or homes or places of worship or society at large. Where again, in any of those situations, in any of those relationships or locations, the circumstances create situations where we are being told we're either too much or not enough in some way that makes us believe we are defective or unacceptable. Shaming aspects can come in from culture, cultural backgrounds, cultural upbringings, different religious backgrounds and religious upbringings. Prime example I feel a lot of people can resonate with is the shaming of sex and the shaming of premarital sex in many religions. But regardless of how the shame may have started, once it is there, we as individuals then often start to perpetuate the shame cycle. And we become quite critical of ourselves and really harsh in our internal dialogue. And this self-perpetuating cycle that we get into creates a lasting sense of us feeling that unacceptableness, that defectiveness. So even though shame may have begun as feelings from an interaction with a parent, a sibling, a relative, or some force outside of yourself, you may have begun to believe that story and internalize it and allow it to become part of your belief system, which then has led you to perpetuate the cycle and to be in this cycle of shame. Now, as I mentioned earlier, shame is tied to trauma and addiction. Although when you try to get a full grasp on it, it's quite the conundrum, a bit like the chicken and the egg, which came first. because the shaming that we go through in our lives can create trauma, whereas trauma we experience can create shame. But shame can also create addictions, but having an addiction can also create shame. And really, all of those things swirl together and are interwoven. And it can be almost futile to try to really determine the cause of this self perpetuating cycle. But what this does mean, and why I bring it up, is we do not have to get super specific or get 100% clarity on where the shame came from. And where it came from is always going to be unique to you. It's going to be unique to the individual. So quite honestly, again, it's not imperative we have a definite answer at the precise moment shame came in and that we know the exact root of, where and when it came in. Although as I've experienced it, and the reason I'm bringing it up in this more exploratory podcast is that as you create some awareness around the roots of shame, it can really be helpful to navigate your healing, your recovery, and your transformation journey. Now, I'm sure what you all have been just eagerly awaiting for in this podcast, now that we know what shame is and where it comes from and what it can do to us, right? How in the heck do we get rid of it, right? That's what we want. We want to release that shame and to move past it in our recovery and transformational process. And as I work with clients, I'm all about approaching recovery and healing and transformational journeys in a very holistic way, because it is about holistic recovery. And what this means is that, just as our shame and trauma stories are always going to be unique, our healing and transformational journeys will always be unique to you. They're going to be unique to the individual. And they're going to include different body, mind, spiritual practices, and really include what you need for your healing journey. So I'm going to share a few practices today that I have personally incorporated on my journey, and ones I have found that both with myself and with clients are helpful to let go of shame. This is certainly not an all-inclusive list. Okay, but if you are out there on the journey, of recovery and transformation, these can be great starting points, especially if you're starting off going it alone and you want to do some personal work. But as always, we can always go farther together. So if you do want support on your journey and you want to talk about specifics, make sure you use the link below. You get on that clarity call with me, and we will dive into discussing, your journey and what your recovery strategy and recovery plan can look like personally. But let's now talk then about the practices I have found for working to clear out shame. And number one, as with many of my practices for healing and transformation, it all begins with self-awareness. The first step to moving past shame in your life is to recognize where it currently exists. We need to begin to notice, where maybe are we being shamed by others in our lives? And also, in what ways are we shaming ourselves and perpetuating that cycle? I would invite you to notice, and get curious. Do you say things to yourself like, that was stupid, I can't believe you did that? Or, gosh, you look so terrible today. Or maybe something like, why are you such an idiot? I can't believe you would say that. Or maybe you begin to notice there are people in your life that are saying similar things like that to you. You're always so sensitive. You just need to lighten up. Why are you always messing up and making mistakes? Or even something like, you don't have enough courage to do that. All of those are shaming statements. So again, start by getting curious and not judgmental. There's no need to bring judgment into this process. Get curious about the shame you carry, or, the shame you're allowing yourself to take on from others. As I've seen it, while we may take on some shame from others, I feel it's important to recognize that most often the person who is shaming you the most is going to be you. And I say that because it is simply an invitation here, again, to just hear that more clearly, to become more aware of that. There is no need, and I'm certainly not advising you to turn up the volume, and listen and tune in louder to the shame, the shaming statements you might be putting on yourself. But just get curious and see if it's there and see how often it is there, and just notice, again, without judgment, and putting the light on it. Putting that self-awareness on it is always the first step in the healing and transformation process. So part 2, as I alluded to a little earlier in this episode, is, try to get more understanding of where the shame comes from. And again, we don't have to get super precise here, but ask yourself a few questions. Where do I feel this shame originated from? How did it start? How am I perpetuating it? And in what ways am I allowing it to perpetuate in my life? Maybe it's in certain relationships, maybe it's in your work. But as you try to understand where the shame comes from, and asking yourself, think about maybe some of the self-limiting beliefs you hold. That can be a big window into the shame origination and where it started. Looking at it as these belief systems and these stories that we hold that, we are unworthy or we are not enough. Think about maybe someone in your life who told you that, or, a member of the church or somewhere in society you heard these things. Because understanding the origins really can further help our awareness and bring clarity to the fact that this is not the truth of who you are. It will allow you to see that you were not born with this shame. Most often, again, you will see that it happened with some experience or interaction with someone. And then you started to believe it because maybe it happened more frequently. And then you started to perpetuate that cycle. But you were taught these belief systems. You were not innately born with them. So as I mentioned earlier, this practice and this process here is not about getting 100% clear on the exact moment the shame came in or knowing exactly where it came from. But this is a helpful exercise to go back to point 1, right? Expanding the self-awareness. And this, understanding your origins of shame, can help you come to the recognition point, again, that this was not something you were born with. So once you kind of have a lot more self-awareness around shame, ways in which you may be shaming yourself and perpetuating the cycle, you have more knowledge around where it came from and where these limiting beliefs came from, then I invite you to bring in some self-compassion and really work to look at all of this with a lens of curiosity rather than judgment and criticism. And this is where, with inviting in compassion, you can begin to change the script in your life. One thing that comes up for me here that I say often to people is stop shoulding on yourself, right? And start coulding on yourself. Should usually comes from shame. So any of those should statements out there are usually rooted in shame. While a could statement comes from compassion. So let me give you an example here. If you say something to yourself like, you should be eating healthier. I can't believe you're eating takeout again. Catch that shame is in there. That statement is a very shaming statement. And if you, again, catch yourself shoulding on yourself, in the moment, change it. Give yourself a new script. And maybe you say something like, I could be eating healthier, although right now I'm choosing to order takeout. But that simple shift in language changes the energy of your words from shame to possibility, to choice. And it invites in a little bit of compassion. But when we shift from the shame to that possibility, that choice, and come at it with more compassion, it actually energetically is allowing us to take back ownership of our life and realize that we are in charge. Again, this shifts the energy from criticism to curiosity. And when you give yourself the could statement and invite in that compassion, you can then work toward acceptance and self-love. Because it actually begins to make it easier to make healthy choices or make healthy changes in your life when you come at them from a place of self-love, from a place of compassion, instead of a place of self-hatred and criticism and shame. So in this space of compassion as well, invite in more gentleness. Being gentle with ourselves and acting out of love for ourselves. Again, instead of out of the shame and the fear, it is a beautiful way to start shifting the energy away from shame, and into higher vibrations of things like compassion. So again, as you invite in some compassion, remember, no more shoulding on yourself. Start coulding on yourself. Shift it from shame to compassion. Now, the next practice I will say I have found super helpful, and I know a lot of my clients have found this beneficial, is working through a forgiveness practice. Oftentimes, it can be really difficult to get out of the shame cycle without some forgiveness work. And when I talk about forgiveness here, it could mean forgiveness of others. However, because it can be so prevalent that we are perpetuating our own shame cycle, oftentimes the forgiveness work is going to be self-forgiveness work. The life we are currently living, and your current circumstances really are a reflection of the beliefs you hold about yourself. And even if you don't particularly like where you are right now, and maybe you haven't realized until, listening to this podcast that you have been carrying around the shame, know that it can be changed. Your circumstances can be changed. And forgiving yourself for anything that's transpired in the past that you've been shaming yourself for, is going to help you in this healing process. It's going to help you change your circumstances. So know that your worth, your enoughness, your love for self, your love for others, your deservingness, none of that is defined by your current circumstances. So work to forgive yourself for any past transgressions that you've noticed you're holding on to. And in two ways, I would say, I think it's important to maybe approach the forgiveness and the self-forgiveness in two ways. And number one is by creating space for it. So you can build in some self-forgiveness work into, your spiritual practice work, to a morning meditation, evening meditation, whatever your self-care practices may be. But you can also catch it in the moment. I know personally, I started working on creating a pause when I notice any shaming statements come up. And I usually can see the root of where they're at, or what belief system they're held in, or what past transgression I maybe need to forgive myself on. And I take a pause and I just say, which is similar to the Ho'oponopono, Hawaiian prayer for forgiveness, is, thank you, I trust you, I forgive you, and I love you. And I usually say my name in that process because our souls love to hear our own names. So think about building in, again, some of that self-forgiveness where you can. And again, maybe you catch it in the moment, maybe you build it into your daily practice. Whatever it is, forgiveness can be a big way to free yourself from the shame. So, the last practice or practices I'm going to talk about are all around cultivating self worth. So, when it comes to shame, you have been holding on to limiting belief systems, um, an old story about yourself that is not true, that is not serving you. And you need to create a new story. You need to work on loving and accepting yourself fully, exactly where you are right now. So, wherever the shame is right now and wherever it started is simply an old story that you need to unsubscribe to. The story that you are unworthy or less than or not enough or even too much, right? Too much of something. None of that is worth the subscription cost. Okay, so it is time to write a new story. And in writing a new story, you are cultivating the belief that you are worthy, that you are lovely and loving and acceptable and so perfect in so many ways just for being you. Now, a few practices I have found that really help to cultivate self worth are going to be EFT tapping, which stands for Emotional Freedom Technique, a really beautiful way to release subconscious beliefs that we hold. Tons of videos out there on YouTube for EFT. I'm a huge fan of Brad Yates and his videos out there. You can also do some mirror work where you look into the mirror and you gaze into the mirror, gaze right into your own eyes and say your name and recite I am statements. You know, you say, Susan, I am beautiful, right? Susan, I am, worthy. Mirror work can be very, very powerful, especially when you are, in front of a mirror, gazing at yourself and using your name. You can also build in some positive affirmations and mantras to help you create your new story and cultivate self worth. A new favorite mantra of mine is I deserve all the good that I desire. It's simple, and I say it several times a day. It's a beautiful reminder of how worthy and how acceptable and how, lovely we are just for being us. So, also in cultivating self worth, it's important to look at setting boundaries with others. Especially if there are people in your life right now that you are noticing are shaming you with statements, set up boundaries with them. And if you are using a lot of negative internal dialogue and you find yourself being very self critical, upgrading your own language to be more positive and setting boundaries with yourself. All of these practices are going to help you cultivate self worth. And underline all of it. And the new story you are writing, the new story you are subscribing to is what the truth is that you are deserving and you are worthy. You are enough simply for being you. So take these practices that I have shared. And again, this is not an exhaustive list, but a lot of these will get you started. And as you feel called to them, and can create space for them, start working with them. Maybe even just start after this podcast episode, start with a journaling exercise to explore shame in your own life and become aware of where, it may exist. And from there, you can then start to begin to navigate, your own recovery and transformational journey. And you can learn how you need to implement these practices and these processes to stop the shame cycle so you can further your recovery and your transformation. But that is it for this episode on stopping the shame cycle. Remember, this is a transformational process to undertake. And to be successful, you really need that deep-seated desire to heal and a willingness for change in your life. If that is present and you've identified you have some shame that you want to work through in your transformation journey, make sure you do take these practices, I've outlined, and begin to work through the process to stop the shame cycle, and really use them to navigate your healing and transform your being. And if you want to go farther on this journey and deepen the work on your transformation, check out my membership, the Alchemize Collective, where I've created a sacred and transformational container for all of us to do the work of addiction recovery and trauma healing together. So you can email me, check out the description, sign up for a clarity call, or go check me out over on Instagram for more details. Okay, tribe, let's remember this is all about making the world a more beautiful place. And that begins with you. Because as you better yourself and you move through your recovery and transformation journey, you beautify our world. I hope you found this episode helpful. I appreciate you so much for being on your transformational journey with me. And as always, if you need support on your journey, make sure you grab your free clarity call with me below. I would be so honored to guide you on your personal transformation as you move through your healing of addiction and trauma recovery. That is all for today, tribe. Until next time, much love to you all. Hey tribe, thanks so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to hit the like button below and then click subscribe so you catch future episodes. And remember, I've got lots of free resources for you to learn about the powers of intentional plant medicine use in order to support your trauma healing and personal transformation journey. So make sure you check them out in the description below and help in making this a more beautiful world for us all. Thanks again for tuning in, tribe. And until next time, much love to you all.